the last class of the day when he came up to see you good afternoon to ensure that you were all still awake. So I'll try to get.
Good afternoon.
We've heard a lot this morning about impact investing. The statistics that we've just seen here on this panel talk to the growing opportunity, but it's still nascent. We're still at a point in a very early life cycle of development of an asset class where the jury is still out. The business model is still not completely clear. Can, in fact, you make money and do good at the same time? It's a great slogan, but in fact, are there practical examples where this has happened and been replicated over and over again throughout the world that proves that this asset class actually makes sense? As Stefan mentioned at the earlier panel, the representatives here as investors, as financial institutions, we're the bad guys. Because ultimately, we answer to shareholders and to investors, and their number one priority is return on assets, return on equity. Ultimately, can you put in $1 and get $2 to $3 to $4, $5 out? If in fact you do that, and you have some positive impact on the world at the same time, that's great. But an investment manager, an asset manager, who's unable to produce the returns will not get a second chance. So I'd like to talk a little bit this morning about why, even though we're the bad guys, why we're necessary as part of the process. We heard earlier about the example of M-Pesa. Here's a company that has a $140 billion market cap that wasn't willing to write a $1 million check to start a new industry, a new opportunity. With a great team behind it, what should have been a clear market opportunity, but instead they had to go and source grant funding in order to make that initiative work. Today it's over a $100 million business. So there's a clear track record of the need for intervening asset managers to support these entrepreneurs that we heard from earlier and the ones that we'll hear from later this afternoon, because what I would argue is the coalescence of impact investing, the synergy between economic impact, social impact, and environmental impact requires tools. If you don't have those tools in your toolbox, it will not be successful. It's good people, clear market opportunity, and funding. And what we do for a living, what we've been doing for 18 years on the continent of Africa, is providing that third solution. But it's not a passive funding solution. It's a very active funding solution. Unlike some of my counterparts in the developed markets, Silicon Valley and others, where you're really finding a great opportunity and it's about the website clicks and so forth, ultimately, in emerging markets, you've got to produce the cash. Because the cash is the thing that justifies the opportunity is real and you can actually make money from it. So why Africa? I left MIT in the late 80s, early 90s, and spent some time on Wall Street and figured there had to be more. Not that Wall Street doesn't impact the world. Unfortunately, in 2008, we saw how that can go the wrong way sometimes. But there had to be a better opportunity for skill sets that I possessed in financial services or in investing to be able to deploy those in a meaningful way. But ultimately, I knew that in order for me to raise money to do that, I had to be able to produce the returns. So you start looking at the numbers. Back in the mid-90s, 94, 95, South Africa was coming out of a very ugly history of the end of apartheid. But it led the continent in a number of telephone penetration. Roughly 6 out of every 100 people had access to basic wireline telephony services. The average for the rest of the continent, less than 2%. So 2 out of every 100 people have access to basic telephony. What would seem like a clear opportunity. Musa started as an advisor, as an investment bank, trying to turn U.S. corporations onto the Africa opportunity. We did that and presented a paper to Bell Atlantic, which is now Verizon, one of the largest networks in the Northeast. And the board asked, well, what are the risks? And I remember sitting in that presentation, scratching my head. I just told these guys, here's a continent that has 2 out of every 100 people that have access to a telephone. What did you not get about that? Now, there are questions around the ability to pay, the ability to actually collect on that payment, right? And of course, the execution capacity to put the stuff in the ground to make it actually work. We fast forward now, maybe about 6 or 7 years after that, we co-invested with MTN in Uganda. The business plan there was for 8,000 subscribers at the end of the first year. Once it hit 80,000 subscribers in the first 3 months, we realized that we were onto something. Even after that, about 4 years after that, in the early 2000s, MTN was the center of attention in the analyst community, in the global kind of Wall Street community, because they were making a bet of $250 million of buying a license in all places in the world, Nigeria. Now, Nigeria, being in the West, is known as the Wild West in Africa, because there's no rule of law. Many people have the experience of talking about the 911 scams and how Nigerians are constantly coming up with new innovative schemes, how to steal your money. So the idea of spending $250 million for the right to provide a new service in a market that hadn't proved itself seemed ludicrous. Well, about $100 billion in market cap later, 50% penetration, a 54% control of the market, and over 40 million subscribers. MTN showed who was right on that analysis. So the Africa opportunity has been proven. It's been proven in telephony. It's been proven in microfinance. And there are several other sectors that seem obvious. Africa contains 60% of the world's arable land. Last year, the United States of America provided about $800 million of funding support to Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia, juxtaposed to most other East African countries, has just over 50 million hectares of arable land. But people are starving. How often do we see on the UNICEF commercials pictures of Ethiopian children starving? So something doesn't fit, right? But you analyze the United States support of Ethiopia's budget, $800 billion. About $450 million of that went towards food aid, putting food on planes, dropping them to local distribution centers and feeding people. $350 million plus or minus of that went to HIV and AIDS treatment. Again, taking medicines from other parts of the world and trying to treat and prevent the spread of AIDS. Of that $800 million of support, $7 million went to agricultural development. So here's a country that can't feed itself, but it has 40 to 50 million hectares of arable land. 7 million, less than 1% of the United States of America's support for Ethiopia went toward land development. How does it go? You feed a person for a day, they eat for a day. Teach them how to fish, eat for a lifetime. So the challenge is an opportunity in Africa is pulling together the tools in order to execute on that opportunity. I love case studies because it tells the true story. So great models have started to evolve in Africa. South Africa has been an environment where they've been under a lot of pressure to show results in a very young economy and a very young democracy since the fall of apartheid in the early 90s. And so there's been a proactive approach towards social impact and development. And economic impact goes hand in hand in that. And so one measure of that is to put financial resources in the hands of the masses. One of the companies there, Kumba Iron Ore, which is the world's largest miner of iron ore on the planet, they did what's called an empowerment program. It's sort of a local derivation of affirmative action. So part of it is very focused on ownership. So what they did was they put together a trust, which benefited all of the employees of the company, which these are guys who were mostly miners, who were making less than 5,000 or less than 5,000 rand. So it's sort of a few $100 a month in income. And in that trust, they gave them shares, which within a 5-year period, less than a 5-year period, resulted in over R500,000 of proceeds to each one of the employees. Now, so you say to yourself, okay, fine, well, you kind of gave them a one-time opportunity to put cash in their pockets. But what Kumba did in addition to that, they hired a small company, medium-sized company, it's based in South Africa, built by a few entrepreneurs that were good at building housing for the mining industry. And so what they did when they did the trust program, they required that some of the proceeds that were being paid out, the dividends to the beneficiaries, be allocated toward housing. And in addition to that, they set up a fund to be allocated towards housing mortgage support. What that resulted in over a 5 or 6 year period is the erection of about 5,000 houses for employees in this area of the Northern Cape called Katu. So look at that value chain for a second. So you have a large corporate, a global corporate, who has economically empowered its employee base. But it's done so in a model that builds sustainability over the long term by helping that employee base acquire one of the most important assets of any individual, which is housing. Right? But in doing so, what they also did was they spurred local entrepreneurship and business development because they gave that housing contract not to a large South African corporate to build the houses, they gave it to a small mid-sized company. It happened to be one of the companies that our firm has invested in about 5 years ago. We made that investment. That company did about $20 million in turnover annually. This year, it's on pace for $75 million. It has a pipeline of just over $300 million in turnover. Why? Because Kumba took a view that not only do I help the individual, but I also build an economy. And I do that towards in the form of supporting mid-sized businesses. Another case study. Small company that impacts by its service delivery. It meets a need. Remember our original business plan when we entered the African investment space 18 years ago was around meeting the need of people making basic phone calls. The example that I just gave of the mid-sized home builder, people need a place to live. Another important area of most developed markets, and it's certainly true in Africa, are people need to eat. And so the business that I'm hopefully going to show the video of now feeds people. Now, not dissimilar from many of the videos that you will see on most impact investing stories. An obvious market, an obvious need, an obvious social benefit because children are eating. The story behind this, however, is a business. What we do is invest in the businesses that allow this to happen. By the numbers, a business in 2008, 2009, turnover-wise, roughly $7 million in turnover. February 2013, just under $100 million in turnover. EBITDA growth from $5 million to $40 million. Number of SMEs that we supported over that period, over 150 small businesses that have annual turnover of less than $1 million US. 1,300 employees, and equally importantly, we feed now, the number is dated, 1.3 million kids a day in South Africa. So I'm going to offer this morning that both to the entrepreneurs and the businessmen and women in the audience, as well as to the investors, impact investing is just good investing. It's a smart way to make money in a market where there are clear opportunities because there are clear needs, and you have a team and the capital behind it to execute on those needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. I'm back on. I'm very happy about that. If there are questions from the audience, then feel free to raise your hand. Somebody will bring a microphone to you. Actually, I have two microphones here if you're short. In the meantime, I'd like to address a point that Nick made earlier this morning, and then I'd like to ask the panel about this. Is there really a funding gap in that range between, let's say, 0 and 5 million? 0 to 10 million? John, is there a funding gap?
I think it's a very challenging part of the market. I think part of what we do is try and help address that by taking different pools of money that are out there and blending them together to meet that area. And that does sometimes mean looking at what's available on the grant side. For instance, the example that I showed above, the plant propagation in Rwanda, a critical component of its financing package was a grant from the African Enterprise Challenge Fund. And that's a repayable grant, so it's not pure grant money. There's money has to go back, but there's no return on that. That blended with some investments by a foundation, blended with a loan from the Development Finance Institution, hit the $4 million that's within the funding gap that Nick has pointed out to get that done. So I definitely think that once you get beyond the relatively small dollars of pure seed money, and before you're in a place where you can obtain growth financing, it is a challenging place. But it is a place where, not just us, where, for instance, there's First Light, that the Great Rose Capital Group set up to try and address this gap. And there are others out there that are trying to get that addressed. I think the Innovations Fund, that Responsibilities Group, is trying to address that gap. But it's certainly challenging. And I'll just make one point as to why that is. When people set up vehicles, investment vehicles, to invest in the impact investment sectors or the impact investment geographies, they typically think to themselves as investors, we're taking a lot of risk going into these untried models. We're taking a lot of risk going into these frontier geographies. We don't want to compound that risk by also taking on venture early stage companies. And so there, from the traditional investors, there's obviously not a lot of interest in this market. And even from the vehicles that were set up to do impact investing, there's a bit of trepidation. But obviously that's the challenge that we're trying to address.
There is indeed a gap, and I recently joined Responsibility. I previously was advising Acumen Fund, which is kind of one of the pioneers in this sector. And we worked with the monitor group last year to kind of define whether it was something that we felt in the market, and where we kind of tried to understand that better. And indeed, the result is clearly, so basically Monitor worked with the 70-ish companies in portfolio of Acumen Fund, and basically went back to the history, the whole funding, and how it comes. And there's clearly, it came out that there is a funding gap, and especially early stage. But I think one needs to look at this whole spectrum of financing and the whole development and the life cycle of a company. And especially in impact investing, given certain risks, business models that still need to be kind of validated in the market, that there are different roles for different types of capital to be played. And I think the example that Mike with M-Pesa and with Ancopa, where there was actually a grant from DFID that allowed to kind of develop the product, kind of test it out a bit, and where then investors came in once you basically come to from something that exists on paper to something that is in a very small environment has been tested, and where investors, it's still early stage, it's still high-risk investment, but at least at that point, or at that moment in the cycle of a company, there is more and more money coming available, and we have responsibility as also, okay, we want to play along the whole spectrum of the life cycle of these companies, but we do have pockets of money that also invest in these early stage, call it Series A if you want to put a name on it, but where we invest in those companies as well.
And South Africa, you see a similar gap, or you feel you're covering it?
No, there's an established gap. I often tell investors while I'm doing the thing that I hate most about my job, which is fundraising, that the opportunity on the continent, South Africa notwithstanding, far outweighs the amount of capital available today. Now, you look at going by the numbers. Last year, I think global private equity raised about $220 billion in new commitments. Africa, less than $2 billion. Right? So now, while at the same time, looking at the slides in terms of agribusiness, 60% of the world's available arable land undeveloped sits in Africa. So you've got 60% of the resource that hasn't been addressed, but all of the private equity funding globally raised last year, less than 10% of it went to Africa. So that tells it by the numbers. I think the challenge also is that you may look at different pockets. South Africa is a great example where most of the DFI investors, the development financial institutions, will say it's overinvested. And today in Africa, DFIs represent northwards of 70–80% of the amount of funding available for project development, particularly private equity in Africa. And so they're tapped out. And so now there's an opportunity, though, for more traditional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, high net worth individuals to start participating in the asset class. The challenge is getting those types of investors comfortable with the perceived risk and the lack of track record of executable models that have been successful.
Thank you. Question from the audience?
It really sounded like it's been sitting in front of a group of venture capitalists and fund investors. What I think some of the audience here would really like to hear is, how do you source your investments? I mean, who you're looking for, what are you looking for in a company who's supposedly going this route? Did I make myself clear on that?
For us, when we think about companies that we want to work with, the first screen for us is, do we believe the impact case? We want to be able to be confident that when we go to the investors who we go to say that this is a company that really makes a positive difference in the world, that is something that can be measured and quantified. And going to a point Nick made early on about the burden that small companies face trying to prove that in fact they are going to have a positive impact. We see that. I mean, we don't think companies should be burdened with a whole series of criteria that they need to show that they're doing something good. But there should be one thing that they can measure and they can quantify that's evidence that they are fulfilling a theory of change that is a high impact theory of change. So we need to see A, that there's a high impact and that it can be quantified and measured by at least one pretty clear criteria. B, that this is a sustainable financial plan that will be viable. And C, and this gets to another point that was made in the earlier panel, that it has the potential to reach scale. Because it's only at scale where the high impact and the high return lines converge. You can make a difference in a community with a small business and a viable business, but you're not going to be able to get returns to investors unless you achieve scale.
It varies a little bit in what instrument and what sector we're looking at. If we look at microfinance, it's kind of fairly easy to identify what your investment landscapes look like. You go to a central bank, you put the list, and you basically you have your potential investees there. It's completely different when you look across all the different sectors: agriculture, energy, water. So that's very different. And in that case, it's first of all, it's a very local activity, and especially if you talk about venture capital and private equity, it's a local activity. So that's also the reason why we have set up offices in Peru, in Lima, that we have set up offices in Africa, that we have offices in India, and in Southeast Asia, that we are expanding that local presence. The second thing is when we look at a company, it's like, okay, is this company broadly defined servicing the low-income segment of the market? And we do not use kind of definitions like DOP or it needs to be $4 a day or it needs to be $10 a day. So we kind of, if we are comfortable broadly that the company is addressing market need in a low-income segment, and we feel comfortable with that, okay, and then we basically look at the business model and predominantly we look at the team that is executing it. That's the key.
Question from Steve.
So yeah, this is a question for William. Can you talk about, you mentioned that you hate fundraising. Can you talk about some scars that you might have had in your experience where sometimes the tail might wag the dog? Has it ever happened to you where your intentions to deploy money in Africa didn't end up materializing because of concerns that your investors might have had, and so you might have ended up doing something differently than you would have liked to do it because of an investment committee requirement or some kind of LP pressure? Has that happened to you?
Yeah, how long do we have to tell the war story?
So, like, be honest.
Look, I think the first part of the question, just the fundraising experience for Africa, and having done it over a few decades now, there's always an excuse from investors why not, and whether there's the U.S. is .com, and so the competitive returns you're getting in the U.S. and a perceived stable risk market makes a lot of sense, and so you're trying to convince investors to take their money out of Yahoo or Google to go into the quote-unquote dark content. That presents a challenge. You fast forward to post-Lehman, where obviously the perception of risk obviously has been redefined now. Now the challenge around Africa resolves around things like political risk, secondment of assets and so forth, land and farm invasion, whatnot, crime. So there's always a reason why I hate fundraising, because you're having to convince an investor that the risk is manageable, it's predictable to the extent that risk is predictable, but certainly something that can be adjusted to in real time. The thankful lesson that we've had over the years, we've deployed our second fund now. I've stayed away from DFIs, and I've stayed away from, to date at least, purely institutional investors. It's been more high net worths, family offices, etc. And it's driven by people who are quote unquote self-made / entrepreneurs, and so they're trusting me as an entrepreneur myself, going into a new area, that I have the team. This is the answer to some of the last question. Our team is capable of executing, and so the blessing has been I've never had a situation where my decision and investment committee has been overridden by an LP. The frustration I have had is that, again, by case study, so we invested in Sonatel, which was the telecom or BT equivalent in Senegal in the late 90s. We invested $10 million US. France Telecom begged us to co-invest $100 million next to it. Now, this was in a business that had a $300 million market cap at the time. Now it's just under $1 billion, right? So we made a 5 times return on our money, but how much more could it have been if they would just believe? And so my frustration sits in just, allow me to do my job, because the perception of risk for these emerging markets and African economies is not the reality. And they are capable, again, to the last question, the number one thing we believe in and look for are ability for me to make an investment and return capital to my investors. In order to do that, I need teams. I need jockeys, men and women, who are capable of keeping the lights on late at night, burning the midnight oil, and doing it at all costs with integrity, getting the job done. And I think the opportunity that's very clear in Africa is that there's an abundance of human capital that hasn't taken advantage of the market opportunity because of the lack of financial capital.
What will be your advice to social entrepreneurs? John?
I mean, in specifically with regard to the fundraising aspect, is prepare for a much longer haul than you, in your mind, is sort of like you do a home improvement, triple the budget and double the time. You gotta really prepare for a much longer haul than you might have expected at the outset. And it turns out it happens a lot quicker than that, all to the good, but it's not likely. And recognize that it is a process that ideally will help you improve your proposition. I mean, we did have a lot of talk about how whether investors are positive or negative impacts on the whole process. And no matter what, they're providing input, they're providing feedback. And I think it is very important when social entrepreneurs are out there trying to raise capital for their enterprises to listen as well as pitch and to hear the feedback they're getting. I mean, I do think that for every enterprise we work with, the ultimate company that came out of the process was not the same one going in. And some of the folks who did not put money in still added value by the input they provided.
Thank you. Question from the audience?
The things that I heard you say, William, about investing in Africa, and I remember when I was a child in the early 70s, my mother used to say when I wouldn't clean my plate, think about the children in Africa and India, and we used to refer to those two regions interchangeably as kind of poor regions of the world. And I think about how different we think of India and Africa today. And then had the opportunity to meet Nandan Nilekani, who's the founder of Infosys, on the way back from Davos one year, and I said, what was it that made the Indian IT industry take off? And he said, without even hesitation, he said the government didn't understand what was going on, so they couldn't intervene. So, and I thought that was really interesting, because if there's one aspect that I don't think you really touched on, but I think it's in that kind of counterpoint between economics and politics. I think Africa has suffered, I think it probably arguably has some of the most entrepreneurial people in the world. I think the institutional capital challenge remains the same everywhere. To get the big money to back the right ideas is really kind of is universal. But one thing that I think really holds Africa back, and again, Dambisa Moyo has spoken about this with her book Dead Aid, is governments around the world seem to want to give dead aid to Africa. And I think until but I'm interested in your view, I think until we throw the shackles off of it completely, I think that becomes a very perverse instrument in Africa in terms of getting people to rely on market forces. So if you could just speak to that and tell me where I'm wrong, but that's where I think the big problem still is. If we just look at India and Africa, the money has rushed into India. It's not rushing into Africa because I think, unfortunately, government has not been shown to be, the emperor with no clothes.
That's a very astute analysis, and indeed, most African governments don't know how to get out of their own way, quite honestly. South Africa is a great example of a government that actually, encouragingly so, they kind of get it, right? That it won't be government employment, it won't be the large caps and the mining companies and extractive industries. It'll be small and medium-sized businesses that get the job done in terms of employment and economic vitality for the masses. But though they get it, I had an opportunity to speak with the Reserve Bank Governor, Michelle Marcus, in a lunch meeting, and she asked me, why aren't we getting it right? What's happening at the cold face of execution where you are, right? Because at the policy level, we're coming up with great policies, at least in our own minds, but why is it translating down to the things on the ground? And I think there's a disconnect of most governments in Africa where they're not quite sure of the techniques to measure what they're doing, the impact of their policies. So that's one issue. The other issue is true in South Africa, and it's true for most of the continent as well, is that there's you can blame the West and you can blame Europe for this donor mentality, which I agree with, quite honestly, that is destructive in some respects. But quite honestly, too, as Africans have a welfare mentality, and a lot of that stems from the colonial ties and the history of the continent. And so to break that cycle and break that mentality, it just takes time. It just takes time. And I think but within that, I'm an eternal optimist, in that represents an opportunity. It represents an opportunity as social entrepreneurs, as investors, present different models. And I think the beauty about Africa is that we get that there's a problem. Governments get that. And so they're open to engagement and trying to connect the dots between the various pockets of resources that aren't coalescing in the middle now. And so I think with that, more of that dialogue with forums like this, which frankly, I think next year, inviting some African governments to participate in this process will help them connect the dots between what the tools are and what the ultimate objectives are.
Thank you, Will. I'm gonna turn it over to Zolf, who's looking at us with a hungry face.
Thank you very much, Bharat. It was a great session, John, Rik, and William. It's an interesting subject, and it sort of leads us into after the lunch. After lunch.